As we have seen in previous Sundays, in the ancient stories of Genesis, our species was created in the image of God to reflect God's character in the world, both to all of creation and to our fellow humans. Soon, though, we wanted to be little gods ourselves. We wanted to be the judges of good and evil, who would live and who would die, who would rule and who would be enslaved. Consumed by the desire to grasp the upper hand caused us to become rivals with our Creator and our neighbors, leading to violence and counter-violence, pain and shame. 2 weeks ago, we talked about Cain becoming the first murderer when he grew jealous of his own brother Abel. Today, we hear the rest of the story about that, what happened to Cain. So, Cain was banished. God said, "You were a settled farmer, but now you have to go and be a wanderer, a nomad, and you have to work hard, and the earth will resist you." And Cain said, "But I won't have any safety. Anybody who comes across me will want to kill me." And so God put a mark on Cain that kept people from killing him. Maybe like me, you find that hard to understand. Why wasn't he punished for what he did? Why not an eye for an eye, a life for a life? But remember, Cain was the settled farmer and Abel the nomadic herdsman. And now God says Cain will be the nomad and will struggle to get the ground to yield any crops. What metaphor is that for our own life, I wonder? Is our desire for besting one another causing us more pain than necessary? Are we humans metaphorical wanderers, causing ourselves more pain as we frantically try to grasp the next thing on our list that we are so sure will finally make us happy? But then there is always the next thing. According to Genesis, eventually Cain's descendants started building cities, and those cities reflected the violence of Cain. As city-states competed and defeated one another, the winners created bigger and bigger empires. These empires elevated a few to godlike status and reduced most others to lives of drudgery, oppression, and servitude. The situation became so unbearable that in the story of Noah and the great flood, God decides to wipe out everything. Genesis tells us that God looked at all of the violence and evil on the earth and regretted that God had created humanity. And God decided to wipe them out, except Noah found favor in God's sight. And sure enough, God does wipe out everything and starts all over with only those who were contained in Noah's very big boat. Although many think of this as a cute story about animals and a boat ride to safety, those who think more deeply about it find it a very disturbing story. The image of violent oppressors and innocent victims being swept away together, with only a handful surviving on the ark, it seems to only make a bad situation worse. At the very least, it is not unreasonable to think, would God not have had more creativity and better planning and foresight than to create a supremely good world and then wipe it out when it fairly quickly went bad? Right? Isn't God better than that? Well, to properly understand this story and others like it, we really need to pause. We need to remember that ancient cultures were oral cultures. Very few people were literate. And oral storytelling was to them what reading books or using the internet, going to concerts and movies and watching television are to us today. Ancient stories had a long life as oral compositions before they were ever first written down. As oral compositions, stories could evolve or change over that long period of time. Perhaps with each retelling, some of the details grew to be more dramatic. We actually have one of those stories in our family. It's a funny story that I'll have to tell you some other time, but I'm sure you have ones like that too. Maybe the great fish you caught that got heavier and longer with every retelling. Maybe that's why the descendants of Adam are so old in Genesis 5. They lived a little longer with each retelling. I don't know. It may not exactly be a case of exaggeration in these ancient stories, which we find in Genesis, but I think it is valuable for us to hold on to this idea of the stories changing over time as they were orally passed down from generation to generation. And we cannot forget that our ancient Hebrew ancestors did not live in isolation. Listen to these words and try to guess where they come from. When the number of people started to increase throughout the fertile lands, daughters were born to them. The divine beings saw how beautiful these human women were, so they married the ones they chose. The God said, "My breath will not remain in humans forever because they are flesh. They will live 120 years. In those days, giant Nephilites lived on the earth, and also afterwards, when divine beings and human daughters had sexual relations and gave birth to children. These were the heroes and warriors of the past, famous men." Divine beings or sons of God having their way with human women. Any guesses where this comes from? Well, it's in the Bible, friends. I admit, I almost fell off the couch when I read these words while I was in seminary. I'm sure I must have read them before that, but had just blocked it from my memory. They come right at the beginning of Genesis chapter 6, right before the story of the flood begins. It's an interesting glimpse into the thinking of the time, and it seems out of place in the Bible. Perhaps the ancient Hebrews were simply recounting the thinking of the dominant culture, or perhaps they thought there was just enough perceived truth for it to remain in their oral storytelling until it was finally written down. Theologian and minister Brian McLaren explains this evolving of the ancient stories this way. He says, for ancient people in oral cultures, a story was like a hypothesis. A good or helpful story, like a tested hypothesis, would be repeated, improved, and enhanced from place to place and generation to generation. This makes sense when we consider that every ancient culture has a great flood story with various ways to account for why it happened. Sometimes competing stories would stand side by side like competing theories, awaiting the time when one would prevail or one would fall away and fade. Maybe that accounts for why the creation stories of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are so different and irreconcilable in their details. Neither one prevailed and neither one faded away, so they both remain. In very important ways, storytelling was, like the scientific process is now, a way to seek truth, a way of grappling with profound questions, a way of passing on insights. As our ancestors deepened their understanding, their stories changed, just as our scientific theories change over time, as new insights are revealed through research. McLaren goes on to say that in this light, we can consider the Noah story as an adaptation of an even older Middle Eastern story. In one of those earlier versions, a gang of gods release a catastrophic flood as a personal vendetta against some noisy humans who kept the gods awake all night. Ancient Jewish storytellers would have found that repulsive. So they adapted that story to reveal more of God's true nature. They replaced the many vindictive gods who were irritated from a lack of sleep and instead reveal one creator God who unleashes a flood to flush out violence. That's certainly a step in the right direction. But the process doesn't need to stop there. After all, the violence of God in this story doesn't really solve anything long term, since Noah's family quickly finds itself making bad choices. So eventually, things are just as bad as they once were before the flood. The story of Noah and his sons and the listing of their descendants runs from early in Genesis 6 through Genesis 10. Then in chapter 11, we come to the story of the Tower of Babel. And I think most of you know that story where they're going to build this tower that will reach all the way to heaven. Here we see a similar pattern as before. Now the ancient world has built towering structures, huge pyramids, and monstrous temples, all with the labor of people who had been enslaved, who were captured and held through violence and pain. The common story or belief in those days assumed that the gods chose a few rulers to sit at the top of the class pyramid, with all those below working to benefit those few privileged at the top. The masses were destined to serve. Those at the bottom toiled the longest and hardest, making bricks for the buildings, irrigating fields, and other grueling physical labor. The higher up you were, the less physically taxing was your work. But it was all meant to benefit those at the very top. Kind of sounds familiar to what we see today, doesn't it? It was generally assumed that the gods were pleased with the status quo, as they were the ones who put the pyramid of power in place. But the Jewish storytellers of the Tower of Babel realized that the one true living God must be better than that. So in their story, the Tower of Babel represents another form of rivalry with God, while it also conveniently explains how people, all descended from Noah and his family, end up speaking so many different languages. In this story, God opposes the soaring ambitions of the powerful few who seek to dominate all others and keep them tightly under their control. Therefore, God diversifies the languages, causing the ambitions of the global empire to fail. This failure of humans to be like God is memorialized forever in the story of the unfinished tower. That new version of the old story is a step in the right direction. As we continue to progress through the biblical library, these stories interact with one another again and again, and together they reveal an ever-deepening vision and understanding of God by our ancient ancestors. These stories reveal a God who consistently opposes the oppressors, a God we can trust, who consistently refuses to support the pyramid of power, and who consistently takes the side of the poor, the humble, the weak, and the oppressed. And we eventually come to see a God who consistently has a preference for nonviolence over violence, equality over dominance, and justice over injustice. McLaren says that taken together, these stories make one of the most audacious claims in all of history. The living God does not uphold the status quo where the rich get richer on the backs of the poor. God even sent Jesus to walk among us, teach us, and remind us that God repeatedly disrupts the status quo, breaking it open so that something better may emerge. McLaren also says, if we're not careful, we can become complacent, and we can get comfortable with the status quo of injustice, oppression, and violent inequality still happening in our world today. And that's why we are wise to gather together often and retell these ancient stories. Take heart, my friends. Rather than being conformed to this world, we can help write a new chapter as we seek to be transformed by a better and a different story, so that we may continue to work with God in the healing of the world. May it be so.